In the Teresa Halbach murder investigation, Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were accused of murdering Teresa and burning the remains in a large open fire pit behind Avery's trailer. Investigators also allegedly found burned-up phone parts in one of the burn barrels. While researching the case after watching Making a Murderer, I noticed that there was no mention of a bonfire in any of the initial witness interviews, but that over time the statements evolved considerably. This is important because if there wasn't a fire, it proves that Teresa's remains were not burned there as alleged. It is definitely an indication that Stephen Avery was set up for the murder, and sadly Brendan was collateral damage, as he should have never been drawn into this at all. And it also shows that the investigation was corrupt, and that witness statements were molded over time to fit the state's narrative. I published a blog article about the bonfire and the early witness statements, beginning with Stephen Avery's. Stephen Avery was first interviewed on November 6, 2005, asked about when was the last time he burned, and he said 2 weeks ago. And what did he burn? He burned garbage. He was interviewed again on November 9th by Agent Fassbender. That was actually the day that he was arrested on the weapons violation. And he was asked when was the last time he burned, and he said that it had been longer than a week. He did not burn anything that night. Some may think, well, it's Stephen Avery. If he actually did this, then he'd be lying about the bonfire. But what about the other witnesses? Let's look at their statements. Let's begin with Blaine Dassey's statement, who is Stephen Avery's nephew who lived also on the Avery salvage yard property. So Blaine was interviewed on November 7th, which was 2 days after the RAV4 was found. He told the investigators that he got off the bus and that he planned to go trick-or-treating. It was Halloween. He did not mention a bonfire. And during that interview, he was first asked about the burn barrels. Did he recall seeing any of the burn barrels being used that day? He did not. And then next, during that same interview, he was specifically asked about a bonfire. Were there any bonfires that week? He said there was not. He would know because he enjoyed the bonfires. He would have remembered that. And Blaine further described that they were supposed to have a bonfire that Thursday. So it wouldn't have been on the Monday, October 31st, but that Thursday. But he told investigators it was canceled. And this is important because Brendan Dassey's statement of the bonfire was consistent with Blaine's. Counter to all of those early interviews with Blaine, at trial he said that he saw Stephen burning plastic in a burn barrel. Also at trial he testified that he saw Stephen sitting in front of a bonfire at 11 o'clock that night, counter to all of his earlier interviews. Next we'll look at Bobby Dassey's testimony at trial about was there a bonfire. Initially, when he's asked, he says he didn't see anything. He doesn't recall seeing anything. And then later, he was asked specifically, did you see a bonfire by your Uncle Stephen's? And he said yes. He said he hadn't seen one since 2 weeks before that, which is actually consistent with what Stephen had said and Blaine, and I believe Brendan. Scott Tydek's statements about the bonfire evolved more than any of the other witnesses. He initially mentioned nothing about it. He just simply said that he saw Barbara. She was standing outside with Stephen and one of her younger sons. No mention of the fire. But then during the next interview, he said that he saw Stephen with one of Barb's sons at between 5:15 and 5:30 standing around a fire, and that when he went to take her home at around 8 o'clock, they were still standing around the fire. And then the story evolved even further. Now it was a big fire in the burn pit. And yet by trial it had actually evolved even further. And now it was flames as high as the garage. And the fire was so important that it stood out to him the most about his day. And next we'll look at Brendan's statements. So Brendan was interviewed on November 6th. And he said that, again, just like the other kids had said, they were going to have a bonfire on Thursday. But it was canceled. Barbara canceled it. There's no mention of a bonfire on October 31st. So Brendan was then interviewed at his school by the investigators on February 27th of 2006. And at the very beginning of the interview, the investigators told him there was a bonfire. See, by that time, it was a fact. It wasn't even, the story had evolved so much that it was accepted as fact. And this was what Fassbender said. He said, Brendan, we know that Halloween and stuff, you were with him and helped him tend to a fire and stuff like that behind the garage and stuff. So he told him there was a fire. Brendan didn't say there was a fire. So after all of those witnesses were coerced to tell the bonfire story, it was accepted as fact. And in fact, Barb talked to Stephen when he was obviously in jail. And he described, yeah, there was a bonfire, and then Jody called. Then I talked to Jody. So everybody, Stephen, Brendan, everybody had accepted it. They said there was a bonfire. But really, there was probably nothing remarkable to them at all about that night. But everyone said there was a bonfire, so they accepted it. Josh Radin initially told the police that he saw a drum fire on October 31st. But he stated that he was pressured to describe it as a large fire in an open burn pit behind Avery's garage. Recently, he did an affidavit where he said that police wanted him to change his story to include a larger fire. He said he eventually said, hey, what do you want me to say? They told him that they wanted him to just say the truth. And he said, I have been telling the truth. So 4 witnesses in all were coerced to give statements that there was a bonfire the night that Teresa disappeared. Blaine, Bobby, Scott, and Josh. As well, Stephen and Brendan believed that there was a bonfire after all of their stories came about. It resulted in the cementing of the story, and it became accepted as fact. And it's interesting to see how detectives are able to manipulate things to support their narrative. The bonfire story is just the beginning. There were also inconsistencies associated with the discovery of the bones, as well as the identification of the remains. Please read more about the case at my blog site, Stop Wrongful Convictions at WordPress. Thank you.